Good morning. Welcome to the Green Mountain Book Festival. I'm Angela Palm Hopkins, and I have the honor of moderating the Memoir Life on the Page panel today. So today you'll hear from 3 Vermont authors, including Governor Madelein Kunin, Jay Parini, and Brett Ann Stanciu. I'm going to take a moment to introduce each panelist, and then we'll have them share a page or two from their recent memoirs. First, we're honored to have Madelein May Kunin, the first woman to be elected governor of Vermont 3 times. And she was also a U.S. ambassador to Switzerland and U.S. Deputy Secretary of Education. She has written 4 previous books: Living a Political Life, The New Feminist Agenda, Defining the Next Revolution for Women, Work, and Family, Pearls, Politics, and Power, Coming of Age, My Journey to the 80s, and Red Kite, Blue Sky. She is currently James Marsh Professor at Large at the University of Vermont, where she gives guest lectures on feminism and women and politics. She also serves on the board of the Institute for Sustainable Communities, a non-governmental organization she founded in 1991, and she launched Emerge Vermont to encourage and support women in politics. Please also welcome Jay Parini, a poet, novelist, and biographer. His poems include New and Collected Poems, 1975 to 2015. His novels include Benjamin's Crossing, The Apprentice Lover, The Passage of H.M., The Damascus Road, and The Last Station, which was made into an Academy Award-nominated film starring Helen Mirren and Christopher Plummer. He has written biographies of Steinbeck, Frost, Faulkner, and Gore Vidal. His other works include Borges and Me, a memoir, and Promised Land, 13 Books That Changed America. He teaches at Middlebury College. Next, we welcome Brett Ann Stanciu, author of Unstitched, My Journey to Understand Opioid Addiction and How People and Communities Can Heal. A recipient of a 2020 Vermont Arts Council Creation Grant, her essays and fiction have appeared in The Rumpus, Memoir Monday, Taproot, Vermont Literary Review, The Long Story, Parent Co., and Green Mountains Review, among others. Her novel Hidden View portrays the challenges of a hardscrabble family farm. She lives in a small village in the Northeast Kingdom with her family. So we'll start again just by kind of warming up the room and hearing some of the authors' work in their own voices. Governor Kunin, if you'd like to start by reading a couple of pages.
Thank you. This is Coming of Age, My Journey to the 80s. As I got older, I was sort of fascinated with the process and started to, as I got older, I became intrigued with what was happening to me and started to write about it. The year I turned 80, the color red invaded my palate. I bought a new red Prius, thinking it might be my last car. Last car sounded like last breath, and I wanted to go out in a blast. If I hadn't worried about the wind further destroying my hair, my ears, and my eyes, I would have gone for a convertible. I had owned my Prius, my old Prius, for 9 years. It was beige, and it blended silently in with the other cars in the parking lot. Sometimes it took me several panicked minutes. It had to be here somewhere to find it in the parking lot. As I pushed my cumbersome shopping cart, I hoped no one would notice that I was lost, or rather that my car was lost. My red car would be different, on the alert, happily signaling me even from a distance. My new Prius was the color of the year, Barcelona red. The marketing people had gotten, can you hear me? Marketing people had gotten it right. Not only did the name feel beautiful on the tongue, Barcelona red, it also evoked sunlit images of the time my second husband John and I visited Spain. I'm skipping a bit here and going on to one big joint investment would be 2 comfortable chairs after we moved to Wake Robin. I spotted the big, red, comfortable leather chair, first sat in it, and declared we should buy two. He declared we should buy two for the study. I didn't think the study was large enough for two chairs with matching ottomans and suggested the living room instead. We didn't argue. Together we looked over snatches of material. I didn't want leather. Perhaps leather was a lifetime purchase, and we did not have a lifetime. We did not inquire about warranties. We looked through the books of swatches, lots of colors and a choice of fabrics. I spotted a bright red square and stopped. It leapt up at me. I asked John, should we be bold and choose red? Why not, he replied with his agreeable smile. I tried to picture the red chairs in our living room. No one, I have not my own glasses, so I'm sort of studying. No question that they would be bright. No question that they would stand out. They would be contemporary. We would not be living in the past, surrounded only by possessions each of us had accumulated over 50 years. Our retirement home would be a sharp departure from that of the couple who had occupied it before us and had just been moved to assisted living. We were the young couple moving in. I pushed away the questions. When would it be our turn? When would we have to move out to assisted living or skilled nursing in the Linden building? It had been hard for the other couple to leave, but they left nothing behind, and I was glad. Let's go for the red chairs, John and I agreed. The saleswoman was surprised, and I was pleased to see her reaction. We were not the beige, brown, or black chair couple she had expected. As the months went by, waiting for the chairs to arrive, which had been specially ordered from Sweden, I began to have second thoughts. Would they work as I had anticipated? Or would they be a disaster? Had we decided too quickly? Why hadn't I deliberated longer, given darker colors a chance? When the chairs arrived, shrink-wrapped in heavy plastic, it took two men who had unloaded them. They had to use a knife to release them from bondage. There they stood, two solid walls of red. They're so big, I exclaimed. They look different in the showroom. My husband looked dismayed. John and I became obsessed with the red chairs. We talked about them over breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I would take a look at them before going to bed and again first thing in the morning, in case they looked any better. They didn't. Let's stop talking about the chairs, John said as his insomnia weakened him. Yes, we won't talk about them anymore, I agreed, but it was hard. I called the furniture store to ask if we could return them. The owner was properly dismayed. He was polite and didn't want to displease a customer, but clearly he was upset. Keep them until Monday and then tell me what you think, he suggested. My son Adam said he liked them, and I said, really? If you don't like the color, you can get slip covers. His wife had done that with their car-scratched couch. True, But why slipcover new chairs?
You want to pause there?
I just have one more
Oh,
paragraph.
sorry.
I looked at the chairs once more. I asked myself whether I could ever own them. Would I feel comfortable, or would they always jolt me, make me jumpy, on edge? Why hadn't I chosen the light, neutral textures with which I had surrounded myself in the past? Silent, relaxing colors that made the living room a calm refuge from the harsh and noisy world around. Part of me, I realized, no longer wanted a refuge. I wanted to bring life inside, not leave it at the door. But the red chairs did exactly that. They were loud. They were vivid. Day by day, I began to see that they had been exactly what I wanted: brilliance. One bright morning, my husband and I arrived at the same decision. Let's keep them.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Wonderful storytelling and depth and humor as well. Jay, do you want to give us a few pages, a taste of your recent memoir?
Give you a little. Is that there? We go. I want to be heard. Okay. Give you just a tiny bit of taste. I find it very difficult to find a little bit from a continuous story to read. It's this is a wacky story about something that happened to me 50 years ago when I was a student at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. I was 22 at the time. I'm almost 75 now, so it's a while back. And my teacher, my mentor was Alistair Reid, the Scottish poet, and he was translating Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentine writer. And he said to me at one point, Borges is coming to Scotland to work with me from Argentina. I'd never heard of Borges. I said, oh, good. Who is Borges? He said, Borges is a writer. I said, oh, okay. And so Borges arrived, and I met him at Alistair's house. And a day or two later, Alistair called, and he said, Jay, I've got to go to London. My uncle's very ill. Can you babysit Borges for a week? And Borges, remember, was blind and extremely elderly and extremely eccentric, and I didn't realize he was possibly the greatest writer of the 20th century. And so I went off. I arrived, and Alistair said, remember, Borges, this is Mr. J. Parini. He said, speak louder, I'm blind. And so Alistair said bye, took off, and Borges said, Alistair tells me you've got this wonderful car. And I said, yes, it's a 1957 Morris Minor, which I just bought for 300 pounds. It's completely rusted out. And Borges says, wonderful, I want to see the Highlands. Take me to the Highlands. I said, but Mr. Borges, you're blind, as like you said. And he said, oh, but don't tell me you're blind as well. I said, no. And then I said, no, I'm not blind. I can see. He said, oh, good, Giuseppe. He called me Giuseppe. You will be my eyes. And so I said, well, he said, let's go. He said, and so we took off almost immediately for the Highlands. He said he had an appointment in Inverness with some Mr. Singleton who had written to him in Argentina. And so Borges said, I must meet, I'm going to surprise him. He'll be amazed. He's doing a book of Anglo-Saxon riddles. So we made our way. It was a perilous journey, believe me, in my car. And with Borges, it was difficult. And we got to Inverness, and we checked into this hotel, and Borges said, go call Mr. Singleton. So I went and called, and the operator said, well, you've got the right, it's definitely a phone number for Inverness, but it's Inverness, New Zealand. So I went back to Borges. I said, Mr. Borges, I'm afraid Mr. Singleton is in Inverness, New Zealand. He said, oh, well, Giuseppe, I won't ask you to drive me there. So one damn thing after another. We had these astonishing things. At one point, my car broke down. We had to sleep in a bed and breakfast in this. There was only one bed and breakfast in the town, and it was called Morag's Bed and Breakfast. And I think I'll just tell you this instead of reading it. I don't feel like reading. And I better just tell you the story because it's hard to read, find a bit. And so we checked into Morag's Bed and Breakfast, And Morag said, there's only the one bed, and it's very narrow. And she said, even worse, there's only one toilet working, and it's off my bedroom. I said, oh dear. And she said, no. So she said, before you go to sleep, use the toilet, and then don't wake me. Well, Borges, we'd had about 3 pints of beer, and he was very old, and he had a very weak bladder, and he went to the bathroom about 14 or 15 times that night, and we have to keep knocking on the door and waking up Morag, and she kept looking up with her little pince-nez, and she'd say, not again, not again. And at one point, Borges went in there and stayed in the toilet for he was in there 20 minutes, and I was sitting on Morag's bed, and she said, is your old man dead in there? I said, I don't think he's dead. I knocked on the door. I said, are you in there, Borges? Nothing. Finally, I heard the toilet flushed, and Borges yells, it is finished. And Morag said, the last words of our Savior. It is finished. She said, Borges came out. She said, my old man, his name was Baldy Braid. She said, Archibald, we called him Baldy. He died in there on the crapper. and Borges said, do you know my father in 1938 in Argentina died on the crapper? He said, it's all very frequently the way they go. I'll tell you, the last story I'll tell you was we were going up driving up to the Cairn, through the Cairngorms, very steep mountain, and suddenly my car was stuttering, and I thought, oh no, and I put on the bar, and there's a storm blowing, and Borges said, okay, let's park for a moment and give your car a breather. So I parked it, and Borges leapt out and started running up the street in the rain, and I could hear him shouting from King Lear, blow wind and crack your cheeks, on and on. And then I suddenly was trying to get my brake to hold, and suddenly I realized Borges wasn't in my view. And I said, where the hell is he? So I jumped from the car in this pouring rain, and I saw he had slid down an embankment, was lying face down with his cane out, and he wasn't moving. I thought, oh my God, I've killed Borges. So that was, and so I finally went and turned him over. He said, I'm not dead yet. So, I was, by the end of that journey, I was kind of wishing he were dead, but it was rather perilous. But so I just tell all the stories of this astonishing journey where we did, in the course of time, I learned a great deal about literature. Borges was a walking encyclopedia. I learned about life. He said to me when we took off, I shall tell you everything I know. I'll teach you about literature and love, which are the only two subjects that matter. So that's my book. Is about literature and love.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
Before we move on to Brett's? Yeah. Why did it take 50 years to tell the story?
People often said, why did you wait 50 years? Because I never thought of writing a memoir, mm-hmm. and I've always hesitated. I was writing poetry mostly and novels, and I was in 2017, I was making a film based on my biography of Gore Vidal. We were shooting in Italy, in the south of Italy, and Kevin Spacey was playing Gore, which was unfortunate. The movie still sits in the can, but it's beautiful. Will be released one day. But lots of people visit a set of a movie, and I was sitting there having lunch with Spacey and with our producer Andy Patterson and a visiting British director, Ross Clark. And Ross pulled the stories of Borges just casually out of his briefcase. And I said, do you like Borges? He said, I love Borges. He's the only writer I ever read, just read him over and over. I said, well, 50 years ago, I took him on a tour of the Highlands of Scotland. He said, you what? And I told a little bit of this story of my travels with Borges. And he said, that's my next film. And Andy Patterson, the producer, said, and I'm going to produce it. And I said, well, then I better write something. So he said, let me make some notes. So I went back to Vermont after we finished shooting the Gore Vidal movie, and I sat down in my house in Weybridge. I said, well, I'll just make, 15 pages of memories so we can base it on some stories. And before I knew, within 3 months, I had written 350 pages. Wow. And so I realized I had this, oh my God, I couldn't believe I could remember it. And of course, I had made up all the dialogue because I wasn't carrying a tape recorder. So it kind of turned into a novel in a sense. So it's a novelized memoir, I call it. So that's how it came about. But I never intended to write this book. And it came in a great flood because It was so vivid, and I dreamed about Borges all these years. So, and I thought of these, and every little scene in this story I had told at dinner parties and to friends over 50 years. So, you know how you get your stories set? And so I had all these set pieces, these anecdotes, and I just knew every little bit of dialogue from memory. So that's how that happened.
Grateful you finally wrote it down. Great
Yeah.
story. So Brett, tell us, I guess we're kind of freestyling up here. You can read a little bit to give us a feel for the book, or tell us about your book.
Well, I think I'll just tell you a little about my book, too. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be on this panel with two people whose work I've admired and followed for years. So it's a pleasure to be here. So my book is Unstitched, and I'll just tell you a little bit about my book just so you have a sense of who I am and what the book is about. It's my second book, and it's not a book I originally intended to write. I never intended to write a memoir to begin with. But what happened was this. A few years ago, I took a job as a librarian in a one-room library north of Montpelier in Woodbury, Vermont. And it's a little tiny one-room library. And at that point in my life, in the story of my life, I was recently divorced. I had 2 teenage daughters. And I was really focused on my own life, on raising them, putting us on an economic footing. And I really wanted to succeed at this job. And shortly after I started working there, I realized somebody was breaking into the library after hours. And I knew this by a really thick scent of cigarette smoke on Monday mornings. And it wasn't from someone just passing through. It was very thick and it was very dense. And through the rumor mill, I very quickly realized that the person who was breaking in lived nearby. He'd been doing this for years, and it was also rumored that he had an opioid habit. And my initial reaction was rage and a kind of self-indignance. I wanted nothing to do with this person who I didn't know. And I went to a fair amount of effort to try to keep him out of the library. And eventually what happened is he committed suicide in a way that was devastating and tragic for his family, for the community, and it just rippled through the town in ways that just astounded me. And the night that he died, I was called into the library. It was very cold, it was January. And I drove home and sat in front of my house, and it was so cold. School was canceled that day. And I sat there and I looked through the windows at my 2 daughters, and they were inside and they were eating a chicken that I had baked. And I took this moment to stop what I considered my just crazy, busy, headlong life and ask myself really hard questions. I asked what I had done and what I was doing. And this book, Unstitched, comes out of those questions that I forced myself to ask that night. There's 2 themes that go through the book, and they're interconnected. And the first theme is my insistence on understanding opioid addiction in my community right around me. And very quickly, that became a quest to understand addiction. And I reached out to people who were in recovery who were really insightful, and medical workers, the local police chief, Christina Nolan, who was a U.S. attorney. There's a scene in the book that takes place in this library. And then the secondary theme is my own story that I wound through. And although I had been sober for years by the time this incident happened, I had never really looked profoundly at myself. I had never looked profoundly at my own addiction. And I had certainly never really taken account of the stigma and the secrets and the shame that followed my addiction that I then carried with me into the world. And so those 2 themes come together in this book, where I explore questions about privilege, loss of privilege, illness, and the complexity of disease, and how we treat both people we know and love and strangers and neighbors who we don't really know. And I guess for a memoir panel, what I'll say is, when I begin this book, when I first put myself in it, I saw myself as this isolated single mother working really literally at the edge of a wilderness in Vermont against thousands of acres of wilderness. And I saw myself as utterly alone, grappling with things that I didn't know the answer to. But as I worked through the book, I realized that all this time I was never alone. That was just my perception of that. All the time, my story had linked in through all these other people's stories as their stories linked into mine. And at the very end of my book, I quote a line from the poet Rumi. It's a very famous line, and the line is, "The wound is the place where light enters." And all through this book, I have this real curiosity. I'm just driven to understand what's the light that begins to heal me and my family, people who I come to know and have affections for, possibly for a community. But I also really force myself to look at the wound, to look at myself, how I saw myself as tarnished, how I saw other people as tarnished. And I explore what happens when we begin to cut off those blinders of how we look at each other and what's underneath that. And that's my book in a nutshell.
Very well stated. Thank you. So now I'll ask an actual question of the panel. So one of my favorite things to talk about when talking with writers of memoir or people who have found themselves writing memoir is about the flexibility of form. And as writers of this genre, we actually have a lot of room to experiment with structure, a surprising amount, which is really exciting to me, as well as the varying amounts of personal story and information that we include within that narrative. And all three of these authors really embrace this freedom of form within their works. So Governor Kunin, I was wanting to ask you, you leverage a traditional coming of age narrative in terms of like what that typically means to people, but you apply it to a later stage of life and infuse it with poetry. And I was curious, how did you land on that approach for this book?
Well, as a former politician or as a human being, one of the hard things about writing a memoir is how honest to be, how personal to be. And when I reached into my 80s, I sort of let go and figured I didn't have to watch what I said as carefully as I did when I was in public life, where every word you say may be quoted and not always favorably. So I felt a certain freedom as I got older, and I wrote stories. I think as Jay just demonstrated, that's how we reveal ourselves. And it became easy, though last night I looked over my book and I said, did I really say that? And I was surprised at my revelations all over again. But it seemed to work. And writing about yourself is really beautifully self-indulgent, too. It's an ego trip in many ways. But the surprising thing is when you do write it, people respond. And I was very nervous about being too personal, but people would tell me that's what made the book interesting. So most political books are written as campaign treatises, and they glorify your life, and you only tell the good parts. Well, I think I was as honest as I could be, not totally honest. I mean, you still have to keep something inside yourself. But it was a happy experience. It wasn't excruciating like some writers feel when they write. That's like pulling teeth. I didn't feel that way. I enjoyed the process.
It's always great when that happens. Brett, your book takes a totally different approach, reading much like a true crime at times, with a strong journalistic accounting of detail and sort of like inquisitiveness that comes along with that as you uncover new information. Can you speak to what led you to telling your story in that way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when I originally sat down to write this book, I was going to write it with a lot of factual information and just put a little bit of myself in it. as though I just had the credibility to do it. But in the revision of the book, and I did revise very heavily, I put a great deal of myself in it because I felt there were two things I really wanted the reader to know. I wanted the reader to know really a lot of things about addiction and about our community. I felt those were really important. But those are not the whole story. And the reason I put my story in it is, as Ms. Kunin was saying, stories are really how we understand ourselves. And without putting that in there with the real fallibilities that I have and that I force myself to write about, to me it would otherwise just be statistics. And the other part that I think is important for me to say is I learned so much from the people I interviewed writing this book and the stories that I put in. There was one woman in particular, Shauna Shepard. She was so brave in telling me her story, and it was so revelatory for me to hear her story. Her life had been so different from me, and she was so reflective about it that I felt that was a story that needed to be told. So we understand things through a variety of ways, through facts and statistics, through history, but also the story that encompasses it as well.
Completely agree. Thank you for sharing. Jay, going back to your Borges book, taking us 50 years back in time, you said that allowed you to kind of have some flexibility and take, at least with the dialogue and having to recapture that, to doing more of a novelistic memoir. What does that mean to you, and what other freedoms did that give you?
Well, I really decided to write this as a novel based on real life.
Yeah.
So kind of was inventing the characters, and which, if you're making it as a novel, you want to see character development. So I had to go back and really make the Jay at the beginning of the book really much more naive than the Jay really was, and have him learn things along the way. And be at the end, I had to have Borges and Jay come together in a sense. So I was looking for the satisfactions of fiction, character development, plots coming together, and conclusion. And so life doesn't usually work that way. You know,
Not that neat, no.
not that neatly. So the fictional overlay, I remember, but of course, if you're writing about Borges, who blended fact and fiction, and that's what he did really. And so, I mean, in fact, one of the things Borges said to me was, anything processed by memory is fiction. And that really struck me, and I've thought of that for 50 years. What did he mean by that? And I now know, you know, as soon as you remember something, you're fictionalizing it. Right? If it happened a week ago, you're changing things around, ordering events, improving the situation. So I'm always I like to improve my memory, and so and therefore you shift reality. I was reading an interview with Bob Dylan recently, and he said, "Well, you can't do anything about the present or the future, but the past is open to us. We can revise the past."
Right.
So speaking of memory, big topic, obviously, when you're on a memoir panel. Some memories do stay strong in our minds. Others we lose really quickly, you know, like what we had for breakfast yesterday. But when we begin to write them down, they kind of take on a life of their own, and they kind of require all this attention to really make it work on the page. So sometimes we have to fill in detail, we have to do research. I'm curious how you all accomplish that and what methods you use to recapture those experiences, either as they were happening or from the past. Anybody can jump in.
I'll jump into that one if you don't mind. I think that's a great question. In my book, it's interesting hearing you talk about how you put yourself as a character, because I would consider that I did the same thing with my book. And I would say that equally in my book that Vermont is also a character. And it was really important for me to write about what I consider fantastic things about living in Vermont and not fantastic things. So there's one scene in particular that is at the center of the book. It's a pivotal scene, and it takes place at my house at night when things domestically became very, very dicey. And I describe my house there in a way which I no longer own. I sold it. And I could have written 1,000 different things about this house, but I wrote it in a way that it was shrouded in darkness, because that's how that house at that time appeared to me and my daughters. It loomed up against us, and it was broken in a way that I once saw it as an arc going through the night. I now saw it as listing and ill. And so I used those details to evoke what was happening at that time.
Beautiful.
I think in the process of writing a memoir, you really stir up your memory. I mean, I learned things about myself as I was writing it. As you think about it, and it forms a structure sort of all by itself. So writing is a discovery process too. Just like a painter discovers as she makes the painting, writing is revealing even to the writer.
Absolutely. Anything to add, Jay?
Yeah, I would just add, I think it's fun to go back and do some research as well. So I wrote my notes and I wrote a version of this story and sent it to a friend of mine in Scotland. And he said, the road you're driving on with Borges up into the Highlands, you describe it so beautifully, but that road didn't exist back then.
Oops.
So I got out some maps of Scotland in 1971, which is when I took this trip. And I said, oh my God, they hadn't built these highways yet. So, and I thought, well, I must have remembered going through the mountains. So I had to try to reconstruct which way I would have gone. Because, how do you remember? Because I've been to Scotland endless times since and have driven up to the Highlands. And I've gone on the newer roads. But in fact, that first time I went, I would have gone on roads that, nowadays no one goes on. So that's the kind of research you do to try to make it more real. Yeah.
I hadn't planned to ask this question, but it brings up something that I've experienced. I'm curious if you have as well. I've found that when you get really refamiliarized with memories and experiences and do all that research and really kind of see it and work through it and understand it in a new way, there can be this tension or when you're talking to people about those experiences who haven't thought about it as deeply maybe as you have. And I wonder how that experience has been for you. Do you find that jarring or, do you feel like, oh, well, I'm the only one that really thought about this so long and thought through it and have some things to say about it now? What's that experience been like for you sort of after the writing is done?
Well, when I wrote my first book, Living a Political Life, where I tried to explain how I had gotten into politics. And I mentioned my children, and I was at a book reading, and somebody asked me, how are Peter and Julia and Adam and Daniel? I said, how do you know? And I was surprised that I had spelled all this out. You just have to get used to it. I mean, once you put it used to be the old days, you put a manuscript in the mail. And I remember being at the post office for a long time as she explained to me the different ways of sending a manuscript. And finally she said, well, there's a pouch you can buy. And I thought, great, I'll put it in a pouch. It was like sending off a baby in its bunting. And I felt this great vulnerability. But once I started giving readings or listening to other people's remarks, sort of a wall went up. I disassociated myself from it in a strange way, even though it was still my baby, but I could distance myself in a way, and you sort of have to do that.
I've enjoyed getting letters from people who were there then when I was in Scotland with Borges. I got a letter recently from a friend, his name was Peter Edbury, who was a college friend of mine from St. Andrews, and he said, I was excited to read your book because remember I was hitchhiking in the Highlands, and on the way back to St. Andrews, you saw me by the side of the road and picked me up, and you and Borges and I drove back into St. Andrews. He said, then I was shocked to read your book, and I don't appear. He said, what the hell happened? So I had to write, I said, Peter, it would have been, first of all, I didn't remember that you did actually come with us. Sorry to tell you that. Even if I remembered, Peter, I wouldn't have put you in the car because it would have been inconvenient for my story. So, right? You see what I'm saying?
Facts and memory,
Yeah.
very slippery. Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess what I would add to that is, from both of you, I do put my children in my book, and I did not ask their permission, which that was the way it was. When I sat down to write this book, I realized at a certain point that I had to use the word that you used, disassociate myself. I had to write the book in the best possible way I could write it. And for me, writing my story is also really being part of a mother, and I had to put my children in there. In terms of the public, I love hearing from people, and I love hearing from people saying that they read my book and they saw themselves or people they knew reflected and resonated in it. To me, that's one of the most marvelous things about literature is we can write a book and maybe we'll never even know who reads the book, but yet it still connects with someone else. It's a real strength of writing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I totally agree. So we have just a few minutes left. I wanted to see if anyone in the audience had a question for anyone or all of our panelists today. And if you did, if you'd like to share that with us, you can hop right up to the mic, or maybe there were cards passed out. I'm not exactly sure. Yeah.
We often hear about novelists.
Oh, the mic, yeah.
We always hear that when you're writing a novel, you should show but not tell. And I found out after I wrote my memoir that in a memoir, you're supposed to show and tell. And I wonder if you have any comments about that.
Well, you've got to embody, but just showing and not telling means embodying the narrative, right? Make it real, make it physical, and don't too much abstract thinking about it, cogitation. So yeah, and I think you're right. A memoir, even in like a novel, you've got to have a combination of showing and telling. I mean, you couldn't have any of Henry James if you couldn't tell, because he's telling you stuff all the time. So it's kind of a bogus distinction, showing and telling, I think. I hate to say that as a creative writing teacher, because I've made a living for 50 years by saying show, don't tell. And now after 50 years, can I go back and unwind the clock and tell my students, I was bullshitting you all those years?
Can I make a note of that here?
Yeah. Good question.
Any other questions?
Anybody else?
Okay.
You have to walk a mile.
You get your exercise.
Thank you. When, how, and with whom do you determine where your book should sit, in the fiction or the non-fiction section of the library?
Oh, that's a great question. How do you determine where a book sits, in fiction or nonfiction? I actually programmed that question into my memoir because Borges had said to me, and I remember this so vividly, he had just been in Israel. And he said, if you walk into any bookstore in Israel and ask for fiction, they'll look at you with a puzzlement on their face, because there's one word for narrative, siporet, in Hebrew, and it means just that, narrative. And novels and memoirs and even narrative histories are on the same shelf if they tell a story. So so I was thinking, I was kind of planting that in advance to puzzle booksellers. I know, where would you put Borges, fiction or nonfiction? I don't know. In fact, it's kind of a bogus distinction on some level. So that's what I would say about that. But all through my book, many times I bring up the difficulty of parsing fact and fiction, and so so booksellers have to decide where to put my book. They'll stick it in memoir, wherever that goes, but maybe memoir should be locked in with novels, right? Mm-hmm.
I think that's actually a really good suggestion. I mean, really, books are really stories, and there's really no I mean, you could say that about any novel, that it has real elements of memoir as well into. But this really pushes, it widens our understanding of what story is, I would say, and the real resonance of it.
Okay. Anyone else? Good. Any final questions? We have just 1 minute. Yeah, you want to come up to the microphone?
If you're trying to explain to a publisher what your work is, and I've heard things like literary fiction, trade fiction, so you have to convince them that sending the manuscript is going to be worthwhile to them. Do you, unless I missed, because I came in a little late, so do you make a distinction? I mean, you may say in Israel there's this one thing, but now you've got to convince a publisher, not just the reader. They've got to do the convincing.
Now, they've got to sell and package the book.
Yeah.
So they're going to make a determination, well, let's put this in the category of literary fiction or memoir or trade fiction or something, or popular fiction, right? So they have rigid categories, but they don't hold very well. But it's just a marketing ploy.
Okay. But you've got to convince them.
Well, you've got to say to them, I want this. I mean, I didn't worry about it. I just said, let's call it memoir, and assume that people will understand if they read my book that it's got a big fictive element to it.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know, Madelein, yours was straightforward memoir, so.
Yes, I never, though there may be some fiction in it.
There's also some poetry in it, so.
Yes, it has poetry, yeah.
Yeah. Is poetry fiction or nonfiction? You know, where do they put poetry in a bookstore? They usually have a little shelf, but
Just get the book out there and explain later.
yeah, that's it.
Poetry books are harder to sell, I understand.
They don't sell at all, so.
That's hard.
Well, thank you all for being here today. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Hopefully our audience enjoyed as well. And the books that we've discussed today are for sale over at the Phoenix Books mobile store in the library on the other side of the checkout desk.
Thank you, guys.